The wind howls. It dropped to -15 last night and it will do it again tonight. You have no coat. Not a warm enough coat. No coat. The fur you're wearing right now came from an animal you killed with a rock. If you didn't kill anything this season that was big enough and fat enough to have useful hide, you are wearing the skin of something smaller and it is not doing the job. Your hands are numb. Not uncomfortable numb. Numb enough that you couldn't properly grip a spear if you needed to. Your breath turns to vapor the second it leaves your mouth. And you are standing outside right now because the fire inside your shelter needs wood. And if the fire goes out tonight, people will die. That's not drama. That's Tuesday. For 100,000 years, that was just called winter. We use the word survive loosely. We survived a bad cold. We survived a hard year. Ancient humans survived winter in a literal biological sense. Enough of them lived to reproduce the following summer, and the summer after that, and the summer after that, for 100,000 years. The ones who made a bad calculation, who ran out of stored food, who lost fire on the wrong night, who got wet at exactly the wrong moment, left no descendants. We are talking about a margin between making it and not making it through a last glacial maximum winter that was not comfortable. It was a months-long negotiation between a human body and physics cheats. Most people imagine ancient humans clinging on, desperate, improvising, getting lucky. The reality is stranger. What they actually built over tens of thousands of years wasn't survival instinct. It was engineering, accumulated, tested, refined, transmitted across generations, a distributed knowledge system that consistently outperformed anything a single individual could improvise in the moment, including you, including me, including anyone alive today, dropped into that environment without preparation. We are here because that system worked, not because individuals were tough, because the system was extraordinarily good at what it was designed to do. Let's go through exactly how each part of that system worked, starting with the enemy. Most people think coal is the problem. Coal is not the problem. Coal is the delivery mechanism for the actual problem, which is this. Your body is willing to kill you to keep your core temperature stable. That is what hypothermia actually is. Not your body shutting down from the outside in, your body making brutal internal triage decisions, pulling blood from your fingers, your toes, your skin to protect the organs that matter most. The shivering you feel in the early stages, that's not weakness. That's your body burning through its fuel reserves to generate heat. At a rate it cannot sustain for long. At -15 Celsius, the sequence goes like this. You feel brutally cold for a while. You shiver hard enough that your muscles ache. Then, somewhere around 32 degrees core temperature, something shifts. Your thinking gets foggy. Decisions become harder. You start making errors you wouldn't normally make. This is the point at which ancient humans were most dangerous to themselves. Not the obvious suffering, the subtle, insidious part where you start to feel fine about decisions that will kill you. Then the shivering stops. And this is the moment you need to understand. Because the moment the shivering stops feels peaceful. It feels like relief. It is not relief. It is your body running out of options. Shivering stops when there is no longer enough energy available to sustain it. Below 30 degrees core temperature, cardiac risk rises sharply. The whole process, from first serious exposure to life-threatening state, can take less than an hour in wet conditions. Wet, that's the word. Water conducts heat roughly 25 times more efficiently than still air. Wet skin loses body heat at a rate that dry skin simply cannot match, which is why falling through ice, something that happened every single winter to people living near frozen water, was not a near miss. It was almost certainly a death sentence, not because of the cold, because of physics, because once you're soaked at -15 with no means of rapidly warming and drying, the process that kills you is already well underway. Ancient humans didn't understand the physics, they understood the outcomes. They watched it happen. They passed it forward. Don't get wet. That one lesson, repeated across generations for tens of thousands of years, was the foundation of the whole system. But knowing what kills you is the beginning. What do you actually do about it? The most important person in the camp was not the best hunter, was not the most experienced elder, was not anyone with status, with strength, with speed. It was the person who didn't fall asleep. Think about that for a second. Fire maintenance was the single most critical job in a winter camp. Archaeological evidence from sites across Ice Age Europe and the Middle East shows that hearths were maintained through prolonged periods, not lit casually, not extinguished at the end of the day. At site after site, the hearth is placed at the clear structural center of the space, with everything else, sleeping areas, tool making, food storage, arranged around it. It's not incidental, it's architectural. The fire was the infrastructure, everything else was built around protecting it, which means that every single night, through storms, through exhaustion, through illness, through the nights when every other person in the camp was was too depleted to stay awake, someone had to. Someone's designated job was not going to sleep until relieved, not letting the thing that kept everyone alive go out during the worst hours. Here's what makes this even more remarkable. Starting fire reliably, on demand, in wet winter conditions with cold-stiffened fingers is an entirely different challenge from simply knowing that fire is possible. Friction fire, rotating a wooden spindle into a notched hearth board until friction generates an ember. Sounds straightforward until you factor in that it requires specific wood combinations, precisely dried materials, and several minutes of sustained physical effort in winter with numb hands while hungry. Getting it wrong means starting over. Percussion fire, striking iron pyrite against flint to create sparks, is faster but requires the right stones, which had to be sourced, carried long distances, and carefully not lost or broken. Your fire starting kit was one of the most valuable physical objects you owned. Losing it was not an inconvenience. In bad conditions, losing it was a crisis, and so groups didn't lose their fires if they could help it. When groups moved, following herds, tracking food, researchers believe many carried fire with them. Burning material wrapped in bark or packed into clay vessels tended through the journey. Some evidence points to fire being shared between neighboring groups when a fire failed and couldn't be restarted quickly enough. An ember borrowed from the camp 2 valleys over. Let that land for a moment, because an ember borrowed from your neighbors in February required that you had maintained a relationship with those neighbors across the previous summer and autumn. You brought them meat when the hunt went well. You shared knowledge of where the herds had moved. You were on good terms. That relationship was not social. It was survival infrastructure, maintained months in advance for a crisis you hadn't experienced yet, but knew was coming. Fire had social value, which means having fire was partly a social achievement. Fire extends usable hours in the short winter days. Fire keeps predators back. Fire makes food more digestible, which means more calories out of the same amount of food. Fire is the social center of the camp, where knowledge is shared, decisions are made, children learn from elders. Losing it was not losing warmth. It was losing most of what made winter survivable. Fire keeps you alive when you're near it. The moment you move, to hunt, to gather wood, to fetch water, you're exposed again, which is where clothing becomes one of the most important technologies in human history. Here's the uncomfortable question. What killed more ancient people than the cold itself? More than predators? More than accidents? The answer is wet. We already know water conducts heat. But the next question is, what do you do about it? What stops water from stealing your heat the moment you move through wet conditions? The first clothes were animal skins. Kill the animal, scrape the hide, wrap it around yourself. Better than nothing. But untreated skins stiffen in cold and rot in wet. And no matter how you wrap them, there are gaps. At the wrist, the neck, the ankles, where heat escapes fastest. A wrapped skin keeps you alive longer. It is not a solution, not by itself. Here's the strangest evidence for how long humans have been wearing clothes. Body lice. Not body lice as in the ones that live in hair, a different kind that evolved to live specifically in clothing. Genetic analysis of that split suggests humans have been wearing clothes for somewhere between 80,000 and 170,000 years, not inventing them. Wearing them commonly enough to give a parasite a stable multi-generational habitat. For a long time, the clothes were basic, untreated skins, essentially just draped and held on. They worked adequately in mild conditions. Then, around 45,000 years ago, at sites in Siberia and Eastern Europe, the evidence changes. Bone needles appear, small curved pieces of bone ground to a point with a hole at the wide end for thread made from animal sinew. And this modest object is the difference between everything that came before and what follows. The bone needle is the difference between a wrapped skin and a sewn garment, between a blanket and a coat. Cut hide into shaped pieces, stitch them together with sinew, tight seams that seal against wind and wet, fitted sleeves, fitted hood. The hood is extraordinary. It traps warm air around your head, where you lose a disproportionate amount of body heat, while still letting you see and move. Evidence from sites in Siberia indicates they were making multi-layer garments, fur facing inward for insulation, fur facing outward to shed moisture. Inner and outer layers. The exact layering principle that modern outdoor brands sell today at significant markup, with a lot of technical language as though they came up with it. They didn't. Ancient humans worked it out roughly 45,000 years years ago. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you: the knowledge of how to construct these garments, which animals, which curing technique, which stitching pattern, how to shape a hood that actually seals, lived in people, not in objects. It had to be taught, demonstrated, practiced, passed on. The death of a skilled clothing maker in a small winter camp was not a personal tragedy. It was a crisis with potentially lethal consequences for the group, arriving slowly over the following seasons as garments wore out and no one knew quite how to replace them correctly. Knowledge was the asset. Objects were just evidence of it. Fire handles the cold when you're near it. Clothing handles the cold when you move. At some point, you stop moving and you need somewhere to be. The famous image is the cave, and caves were genuinely valuable, naturally insulated, wind blocking, maintaining a relatively stable temperature year-round of roughly 5 to 10 degrees Celsius. In a blizzard at minus 15, 10 degrees feels like a spa. Archaeological sites in France and Spain show evidence of repeated seasonal return to the same cave systems across tens of thousands of years. And here's the thing about good caves: there aren't many of them. A south-facing entrance, deep enough to insulate, near reliable water, near reliable prey migration routes. Those specifications eliminate most caves. The ones that met the criteria were not discovered each season. They were known, they were competed for, they were returned to year after year. They were effectively inherited. The best caves were not found, they were remembered, returned to, guarded, and sometimes fought over. A good cave was not scenery, it was survival equipment, and survival equipment gets defended. But most ancient humans, most of the time, were not in caves. There aren't enough of them, so they built. The most remarkable constructed shelters from Ice Age Europe are not in France. They're on the Ukrainian and Russian plains, where ancient humans solved an extraordinary engineering problem. In a landscape with almost no timber, the great steppes of Ice Age Eastern Europe were largely treeless. They used what was available in extraordinary quantities. Mammoth bones, sites in Ukraine, most notably Mezherich, show circular structures assembled from hundreds of mammoth bones, skulls as the base, tusks as curved structural struts, the whole thing covered in hides, probably packed with turf or snow on the outside for insulation, a hearth at the center. Some of these structures show evidence of repair, bones repositioned, damage patched. This was not emergency improvisation. This was construction, worth returning to, worth maintaining. The food problem is the last piece. And it's where the engineering gets most surprising. Modern diet culture spent 40 years treating fat as the enemy. Ancient humans had the opposite problem. In a cold environment in winter, with your body burning significantly more calories just to maintain core temperature than it would in temperate conditions, fat is not a risk. Fat is the right food. 9 calories per gram compared to 4 for protein or carbohydrate. Fat is calorie density, and calorie density is what keeps you alive when the alternative is burning muscle to stay warm. Ancient groups knew this, not in nutritional terms, but in outcomes. They knew which animals to target and when. Bears before hibernation, beavers at peak condition, migratory birds before they flew. Many species reached their maximum fat content in the weeks just before winter, and ancient hunters had mapped that calendar across generations. Kill the fat animals at the right moment before the cold burns their reserves down. The most important hunt of the year was not the most dramatic one. It was the patient, methodical one in late autumn, targeting unremarkable animals at peak condition, then render the fat, store it, because the hunt that saves you in February happens in October. Later, cold climate peoples, many indigenous Arctic communities, developed preparations combining rendered fat with dried meat that could provide near complete nutrition through an entire winter in a compact, storable form. We can't say with certainty that Pleistocene hunters used identical preparations, but the logic is identical. Maximize calories per unit of weight, maximize shelf life, prepare it before you need it, and then you don't need to have a successful hunt in February when conditions are worst and prey is hardest to find. Which brings us to the part of this that people find most uncomfortable, because every single strategy we've discussed, fire maintenance, clothing construction, shelter building, time fat harvest, food caching, requires something none of them can do alone. Here's the number: 15, not a magic cutoff, more like a rough lower edge, based on what researchers have modeled from small foraging groups. Once you drop much below that, the winter system starts breaking. You cannot maintain fire through the night while others sleep. You cannot build and maintain a substantial shelter within a useful time frame. You cannot run coordinated hunts on large animals effectively. You cannot guarantee that when the blizzard buries the food cache and changes every familiar landmark, someone in the group still knows where it is. You cannot ensure that when the person who knows how to restart fire from scratch gets sick, there's another person who learned it from watching them. The tribe was not a social preference, it was infrastructure, which means the most important skill in the entire winter survival system was not starting fire, not sewing a hood, not reading a migration route. It was maintaining a functional group, tracking who contributed what, resolving disputes over food before they fractured the coalition, keeping relationships with neighboring groups alive across the warmer months, so that February emergency didn't arrive with no one to call. Managing the social complexity of 15 to 30 people in extreme, prolonged stress without the group collapsing. That is cognitive work. Sustained, grinding, invisible cognitive work. And here's where it gets interesting. The human brain uses roughly 20% of your resting energy budget. That is an absurd proportion for one organ. Evolution does not maintain expensive hardware without a return. So what was the brain buying? Not just fire starting and navigation. Mostly, in winter specifically, it was buying social management, keeping the group intact, tracking who contributed what, who owed whom, who was likely to crack under pressure, planning not for next week, but for next February, running scenarios about threats that hadn't materialized yet. The archaeological record shows this capacity was operating tens of thousands of years ago. A pile of dry hides stored under flatstone in summer, ready for the cold months not yet arrived. A repaired spear kept for the next hunt rather than discarded after this one. A child being shown which ridge the herds would cross when the snow came, not because the herds were there now, but because they would be. These are not the traces of creatures reacting to their environment. These are traces of creatures anticipating it, modeling a future that doesn't exist yet, building for it in the present. That is the thing modern humans are genuinely extraordinary at, and winter is where it mattered most. So, where does that leave us? Fire, clothing, shelter, fat, coalition, planning, 6 interlocking systems. Any one of them fails, and the others become significantly less survivable. All of them working together, maintained through generations of accumulated knowledge held in people rather than objects, is what got a human body through a last glacial maximum winter and out the other side. They didn't have Gore-Tex, they didn't have thermostats, they didn't have a grocery delivery service that operates even when it's snowing outside, which I say with some genuine feeling is a remarkable achievement. They did not have any of the things we reach for when it gets cold. What they had was each other, a knowledge system that only existed as long as people were alive to carry it, and a brain capable of imagining February from the warmth of August and making sure February went differently than it could have. The wind howls, the fire needs wood, your hands are numb, you are outside because someone has to be, and generation after generation, someone was. Enough of them made it through. We are here because they didn't just survive the cold, they outsmarted it, slowly, collectively, at significant cost, and without a single breakthrough invention that changed everything overnight, just decades of small refinements, each one tested by the only evaluation that mattered, whether the people who figured it out were still alive the following spring.